All right. Well, it looks like we're at the top of the hour, so we'll have to save this for our persona in the blockchain conference that we can have in a couple months. Be fully buzzword compliant. All right. So it looks like we've got quite a few people back. So I'm going to go ahead and get started just to keep things moving. So thank you everyone to join breakouts. Susan just said it sounded like pretty much everybody did. That was on before, so that's great. I hope you had some good discussions there. I know in my group we talked about some good things, and we'll actually relate a lot to what I'm going to talk about now. So I think that works well. So I am going to talk to you guys about perfSONAR and Elasticsearch and some of the work we're doing to kind of modernize how we store and visualize results. I think the talks before the break actually led into this really well because you're seeing some ways that people are already doing this. So I'm going to talk about kind of more generally how we're going to hopefully be bringing this to the various perfSONAR bundles that we make available. So I already shared this earlier, but just kind of as a recap, most people when they interact with perfSONAR today, we have a couple kind of standard visualizations that people work through. And so we have these mad dash dashboards and these grids that kind of highlight common patterns, and you can kind of click through and hopefully get further down into what's going on through these line graphs, right? And that's really kind of about the extent of what most people do when they're interacting with perfSONAR, kind of outside of doing kind of custom stuff, right? So we want to expand that out and do a little bit more. And so when we're talking today about, I'll use the term archiving a lot. That's just kind of a term we've used in perfSONAR for a long time to refer to how we store measurements long term. And that's also where our visualizations or the various tools basically pull the data and then display them or analyze them however they're going to do that, right? So we're going to talk about kind of ripping that piece out and replacing it. So my component diagram from earlier that you've probably seen a lot if you've seen perfSONAR talks is here, and the green arrow kind of pointing where we're at in that stack. So what is Esmend? So this name's been thrown around kind of a few times, probably if you've been listening to the talk. So Esmend is the default measurement archive that perfSONAR ships with. It's been around for quite a while. I don't remember how many years ago we kind of transitioned over to it. It was actually originally developed at Esnet. It was developed to store our SNMP measurements, and then we adapted it to also store perfSONAR data. Esnet actually moved off of it some time ago. For SNMP and things like that, but we've kind of kept it around a little bit longer on the perfSONAR side of things. And so basically the way that's built is it's actually got a couple databases underneath. So it keeps what we call the metadata in Postgres. So that's essentially the descriptions of the measurements you're running and like the test parameters and all that. That goes into Postgres. And then it uses a database called Cassandra, which is basically a key value store, and that actually stores the time series measurements in it. And then we have a Django app that sits on top of those two things that combines them as needed and exposes the REST API. And there's an Apache essentially proxy kind of sitting on top of that. So, if you want to restart Esmend on your toolkit, or if you've ever had to, and we've told you to restart Apache, that's why. It's really a Django app living inside Apache. And so that's essentially the equivalent of restarting Esmend. So why do we want to replace Esmend? Well, part of it is, we developed this years ago. And since then, there's been a lot of developments in the open source space around time series storage. And quite frankly, there's just some really good options around that were either not quite there, were not quite out yet when we started looking at this, or just weren't kind of mature enough. Like we had looked at them, but they didn't seem to have all the features we need at the time. So they have since kind of gone along, have got really good support, and I mean, honestly, have just surpassed, what we could ever hope probably to do with Esmend. So we really want to leverage those, right? And in doing so, we already talked about this a little bit with some of the lookup service stuff I mentioned earlier. You get these rich query languages and things like that. Right now we basically have to build our own essentially that ties the metadata and data together in Esmend, and we kind of want to get out of that business. The other nice thing is out of the box, they integrate really nicely with some of these visualization platforms. So you saw really great examples of that in the talks right before mine of some of the stuff that Jayant and the University of Michigan has built in Kibana, right? And they were able to just kind of do that, using the built-in tools that they have to build those. They didn't need no bunch of custom JavaScript or anything like that, which is really powerful. And we have a lot of issues right now especially with the dual database setup of terms of like support for backups, or if you need to do any horizontal scaling or redundancy, it gets pretty complicated. How you actually do that. And we'd also like to kind of open the door going forward too. We know a lot of people like to host some of their services in the cloud or on-prem. We want them to have that choice, right? So like if you want to deploy your database in Google Cloud or something like that to store your perfSONAR measurements because you don't want to manage that locally, you have the option to do so. We're not, pushing that on anyone, but we want to have people have those choices, right? So the other big thing is stability. So I think probably one of the #1 sources of problems that we have on our perfSONAR user list or other places is issues with Cassandra, right? It's just the RPM in particular just has some weirdness to it, and we try our best to hide some of that from people, but we'd really kind of like to move off that and move off that kind of dual database setup if we can. From a development perspective too, since there's so much good stuff off the shelf, we'd really like to kind of focus on, doing other things and making the data useful. So, if we can use some off the shelf stuff, in theory, that should be less custom code for us to maintain, which is a net win. And, as was shown, I think earlier today with the Jayant University of Michigan presentations and from some of the talks or from some of the discussion I know in my group, and just, some experience with other projects, in the LEC community and NetSage, I think they've had a lot of good successes with alternative backends, right? And so again, we kind of want to make that useful more generally to people. So we started looking at alternatives a while ago, and honestly, we've talked about replacing Esmend for a number of years. It just has come down to dev cycles and where we put the focus. And I mean, if you've been following the perfSONAR project, over the past couple of years, we've actually ripped out some pretty major components in terms of, building out pscheduler and NPS config and things like that. So Esmend was kind of next on the list. And so we started looking at a few alternatives. And if you were at my TechEx talk last year, I think I talked about some of these alternatives where we were kind of still exploring them. So I've listed 3 of them here. So Elasticsearch obviously is one of them. You saw a lot of talk, that was obviously what was behind the examples you saw this morning. And within the development team, we have a lot of experience with this and some of those success stories, like within the LEC community and on NetSage and things like that. They have actually been using Elastic, and it fits our data pretty well. One of the things I'd mentioned in last year's talk was we were also looking at the potential for doing a pure Postgres version, just as like a lightweight a way to install an archiver on like a toolkit, like if you just have a one-off toolkit. The idea being reducing install requirements, since pscheduler also requires Postgres. This is actually a pretty interesting idea, but it requires an additional support burden. And as I'll get to in a second, I think it becomes a question if it's maybe just somewhat of an over-optimization. And then like another very popular time series database out there right now is InfluxDB, which is actually a really good tool. You can certainly make some of this stuff work with that. Some of the data structures and things like that are a little bit more limiting, but you also get some more performance and stuff like that. It's super good for stuff like SNMP collection, where you have like very well-defined keys with your interface names and stuff like that. And there's some limit to the tagging you can do because we have a lot of metadata. But I think you could actually make it work in perfSONAR cases. So it's a good product, but kind of when we looked at everything, Elasticsearch seemed to be the one that checked all the boxes for us. And I think it's also worth saying too, this is kind of just the default one that we'll throw out there. I mean, one of the great things about our architecture is we have all these archiver plugins. If you want to do something different, you can do something different. And there's other options I didn't list too. Like if you look at Prometheus in particular, the Thanos stuff, which is like the long-term storage piece of that, there could be some interest there. You could kind of do this stuff all day, but kind of Elastic is where we've landed, just because it meets a lot of our needs. So we kind of started doing some building out and some testing of it. Like, for example, one of the things I'd mentioned is, well, the pure Postgres version might be a little bit more efficient. We did some testing with Elasticsearch just on the toolkit, right, by taking out Esmend, and we actually found it to be a little bit less resource intensive than the Cassandra stuff we have now. So we weren't adding any additional burden. So we think we're pretty well covered there as well. So if you're not familiar with Elasticsearch or the Elastistack, or some call it the Elk stack, right? There's a bunch of different components. So the three that are really part of like the Elastic company that makes develops these is Elasticsearch, which is the backend, and it's really kind of more of a search engine that allows you to kind of put documents in it, and it's really good at searching and doing so quickly, and gives you a lot of queries for aggregating and doing all sorts of interesting stuff. Logstash is probably kind of in some ways the unsung hero of a lot of this, because it's really where things can get interesting in terms of bringing in additional metadata and stuff like that. So it accepts the inputs like from pscheduler and can shove stuff in Elastic, but in between you can actually pull data from other sources like GeoIP information or things like that, and really kind of enrich your data, which enables some even cooler searches once it's stored. And then there's a couple of visualization platforms. So Kibana is the one that's developed by Elastic. That's what you saw this morning. It's really good, as you can see. If you can do some pretty interesting visualizations with it. It is only works with Elastic though. So if you, for example, you want to do perfSONAR data with some other data set that was in a different data store, Kibana won't help you there. So there's actually another one that's an open source tool called Grafana, which is not part of Elastic, but one of the many plugins they have for different data sources is an Elasticsearch plugin. And then they can also talk to like InfluxDB or a whole bunch of other things if you want to build dashboards there. So there's all these really great tools kind of out there, I guess, is the gist in terms of storing and processing this data. So then, if we think about this in the perfSONAR context, how do we kind of put all this together? Right. So this diagram here is pscheduler. I noticed it's a little fuzzy because I scaled it up because it's going to be part of a much bigger diagram. But anyways, the pscheduler component has a bunch of different archiver plugins. So, it has the tool plugin is shown there. It's presumably ran some test, say an iperf test, right? Now it wants to store it. So it can kind of pick the archiver to send it to. And, I'm going to show the simplest example where it sends to an HTTP archiver. But you can also send to some message buses and things like that, which would just add a layer in between what I'm going to show. So if we have the tool send it to the HTTP archiver, that can basically do an HTTP put to a Logstash instance that's listening on an HTTP port, because that's one of the many input plugins that Logstash has. And then it can write to Elasticsearch. But as I mentioned, before it does that, what gets interesting is you can actually pull in metadata from external sources to kind of enrich those measurements a little bit more. So one obvious one is GeoIP, so you can get lat long for like the endpoints and have an easier way to build maps. I put your network DB right there, so I don't know if people run Netbox or have their own kind of internal inventory system. But for example, if you want to associate certain measurements with customers or things like that, if you have that information, maybe circuits or something like that, the idea is you could potentially pull that information in with Logstash. We talked about the lookup service earlier too. You could potentially pull in some information from the lookup service. If it maybe has a better idea of lat long, or there's some other metadata you want to pull from the lookup service, you could do that. Or any other data source to basically associate it by IP or something like that. You can kind of pull that metadata in with Logstash and makes for some interesting searches, right? So the idea is, we bundle perfSONAR a couple different ways. So if you're thinking of like the perfSONAR toolkit, you can actually put like the Logstash and Elasticsearch pieces on the toolkit. Like I said, for the scale that most individual toolkits are running, it seems to be fine. It doesn't really raise our minimum specs or anything like that. Or if you want to do a central archive, right? Elastic's got some pretty good horizontal scaling properties. You can do that centrally, and the archivers can send to remote either Logstash, or Logstash could be local and send to remote Elasticsearch. But the idea is we'll be able to kind of bundle those things together and replace stuff. So I think this is kind of a better diagram of that. And obviously, when I start saying things like that, right, one concern is, well, I've got stuff maybe that talks to Esmend now. So how is that going to work? So we've actually already been testing internally a backward compatibility layer that seems to work reasonably well. We've kind of, I've been calling it Elmond for Elastic and Esmond conversion. Basically, it's just a loose layer that understands the Elasticsearch query API, or I'm sorry, the Esmend query API can query Elasticsearch and then return a result that looks like Esmend. So you'll see in the example here, we've got the visualization components that we already have in perfSONAR today. They can talk to that element layer without any modification, but actually be getting the data from Elasticsearch. So for example, I have a toolkit running like a dev instance that's running Elmond. It was actually based on 4.2.4 because it was before we did 4.3.0. So a current version of perfSONAR, I just turned off Esmend and turned on Elasticsearch and then this element stuff. And the UI didn't know the difference, so it was basically just showing the results kind of transparently. And then, what that gets you, assuming we don't modify those at all, is those will continue to work with whatever they're talking to, but then you have this extra option of doing some fun stuff with Grafana and or Kibana if you want to. And so I think that'll give you some more powerful options there. So that's kind of the idea. I wanted to do a couple quick demos today just to kind of show you some of the stuff you can do. And so let me switch.
There was a question there. Yeah. If we reviewed the timescale database or approach, but
yeah. I'm assuming. So when I said the Postgres stuff, that's actually what I was referring to. Like I said, that stuff looks really nice. It's just how many different things do we want to support, but that could totally, that's totally an option. But yeah, when I said Postgres stuff, I actually meant the timescale DB plugin that comes with that. So, or is an option to install on top of that. So yeah. And like I said, there's a lot of good options today, so I don't actually want to put down any other ones. This is kind of just the one that I think makes sense for us in terms of support and feature desires. But yeah, there's a lot of good stuff out there. So was that the only one or? Okay. So I will then hop into my kind of demonstration. So I've actually set up a few Grafana dashboards. And kind of really my goal today was like, these are all very rough. So these are not going to be like the final form of anything you'll see. I just kind of want to start sparking some ideas for how some of this works and some of the flexibility that they get you. So you see right here, I've just got some standard line graphs, right? So, obviously not the most exciting thing. We have line graphs today, right? But you can see I've got a couple dev hosts selected. And we've got some, throughput, packet loss, one-way delay. I've got some ping tests running between them. These are pretty nice. You can select stuff. It'll zoom in all the graphs on where things are at and what was going on at the time. These dev hosts are kind of all over the place. So I don't know that there's too much we can debug here, but so you can do the basic things that you'd expect. But where things start getting more interesting is when you start trying to ask maybe some new questions of them. So I've got one right here. This is again a map. It's kind of showing hotspots of packet loss, and a lot of my hosts I don't have full good lat long for, so you won't see all of them. But this was pretty easy, just building using a standard Grafana plugin for how to do this. But again, I actually don't think that's the most interesting part. What I like about this is the ability to ask some different questions of the data. So right now, basically, this is running some throughput tests, some OAMP tests, and some traceroute tests, right? And so one thing we can do is when pscheduler actually runs the traceroute, we could do this at the log stash layer, but pscheduler actually already does it for us. Is in the traceroute, it actually does some AS lookups and gets like the AS organization of the IPs along the path. And so what Elastic allows us to do that we can't do in Esmend is we can actually look into the data and ask questions about the data, such as give me all source and destinations where there's a trace route that has a particular organization in the path, right? So if I go down here and I select, since we're at Internet 2, TechEXtra, I can select Internet 2. And my map, again, I don't have great got some echo there. It can basically filter down just the tests that traverse Internet 2. So it does not mean an endpoint is in Internet 2 necessarily. It's just anywhere along the path, maybe is hitting Internet 2, and then kind of filter down the results. Basically what this is doing is saying, give me the source and destinations that have those. And then once it has the sources and destinations, it's basically, down here in the table, it's saying, okay, give me all like the throughput and packet loss tests for those various source and destination hosts. So, so then, we can click on them, go back to our line graphs or whatever to look at them. So actually I want to go back because I wanted to highlight something else that we can do here. I'm going to select one of my hosts here. It's not filtered anymore, but that's fine. So you'll notice right now, it looks like it just has one throughput test, but you'll notice right now that these two hosts, they don't have any packet loss or latency. Well, part of the reason is because the way ESNet runs things, they come out different interfaces. So there's actually a different interface on the same host. It's called -OAMP that we need to select to look at the packet loss stuff. So when we actually deploy these things, one nice thing is we can actually tag the host, right? So we could bring this up, but I haven't done that yet, right? And I kind of want to show how flexible these are in terms of if you don't like the way things are laid out or you want to build your own dashboards, you have a lot of, it's pretty easy to edit these things. So what I'd like to do is actually change these pull downs because right now I can only select one thing. I'd like to be able to select multiple, right? So if I go in the dashboard settings here, those pull downs are built by these things called variables. You'll see they have some queries associated with them that get the list. What I want to do though is make them multi-value. So I'm going to do that for both of them. All right, so both my source and dest, now I can select multiple things. So if I go back, okay, cool. So now I can select multiple. So I actually want to select all of them that, these are all the addresses actually associated with our Washington node. So I'm going to get all those, and then I want to get all the ones associated with our Denver node. Select those, and yeah, now our packet loss and latency graphs show up, right? So that was pretty easy to edit. So you'll see I only have, and we don't run any ping tests, so those aren't going to show up on this. And so now let's say I want to add a new graph of something like jitter. I can do that relatively easily. I'm just going to copy this. I could draw it on the same graph. There's a lot of ways to do it, but I'm going to duplicate this one. And then I'm going to go edit. And you'll see kind of the queries built down here. So this kind of filters out by the source and dest that I've selected and whether it's a latency test. And then this is the stat that it's showing. I could add multiple if I wanted or whatever, but I'm actually just going to replace this with I want to make a jitter graph. So I'm going to select, I'll use the standard deviation measure of jitter. We've got there's some other common measures that are kind of in here, but I can do that. So, and I want the average, let's say, instead of the minimum standard deviation. So I can do that, change the label here. And so now I have a jitter graph in addition to my other thing. So pretty easy to draw some line graphs of new stats, right? So, I mean, I think that's one cool thing, especially when you start thinking about adding new measurements and stuff like that, is it takes away all the thought that have to go into just drawing a line graph, right? Like that's kind of out the window. Like making a line graph is easy now, right? You can kind of, just do that, right? Which I think is really powerful, and you can kind of get to looking at the data. And so these are some pretty basic visualizations. There's a lot of great plugins and stuff, and you can do custom plugins for Grafana. And basically everything I said also applies to Kibana as well. Is basically these platforms just make it really easy to create some powerful visualizations. So if I go back here to my slides, that was the end of my demo. And so I have a couple screenshots in here. This was actually a slightly different one that correlates some perfSONAR data to some host metrics. Which is another powerful aspect of these things is correlating different data sources together. But anyways, those are just in there for the slides for people that want to browse those later. So just in closing, a lot of this is still a ways away from the release, right? So like 4.3 came out today. None of this is in there in the sense that you're not going to all of a sudden have Elasticsearch or something installed on your toolkit. Like this is months out at this point. We're still kind of testing and getting a visualization down. We want to figure out things like how to do mad dash like visualizations in these platforms and stuff like that, and in addition to new stuff. So we're playing with all of that right now. But I highlighted a lot of the positive effects that we will hope it have, and I mostly hope that it just opens the door for people to kind of easily do new and exciting visualization type things with perfSONAR, and just really complete the stack of when you run a test. You basically have flexibility all the way through to add metadata or build visualizations or do what you want. So I think that's it for me. I think I'm right at time. So I don't know if I have any time for questions, but any quick questions out there?
You can mention perhaps about the alerting. as well. I'm not sure, perhaps
We
in
can
the
talk
room
about
you
that.
should.
So yeah, just real quickly. So one nice thing about using this off-the-shelf stuff is there are a lot of built-in tools. We talked about in my breakout, like Elastalert, and Grafana has some built-in alerting. Grafana has some. I've never been able to make it work that great for myself, but others might have different experiences. But there's some great tools out there. I mean, I think a big open question is how do you define the right rules, and if you want to do more advanced things like not static thresholds and stuff, what's the right way to do that? But I think the hope is like you get access to a bunch of different tools now doing this that can hopefully help with that. So, and yeah, I'm interested to hear if others have ideas on that too going forward. So, all right, any other questions? Yeah, thanks, Ivan, for the reminder on that one.
Officially, Andy.